Welcome back to another edition of the Magic Latest Podcast where we discuss everything Orlando Magic basketball. I'm your host, Jalon Dixon, and today we're going to get into Mailbag Monday. Although there weren't a ton of question submissions, shout out to the people who did submit a couple of questions on last week's episode. And I did go through a last couple of episodes to scrummage together some conversations taking place in the comment section to put together some topics of my own to address some of the biggest convos taking place in Magic discourse right now. But remember to like, comment, subscribe for daily Orlando Magic content, and let's get right into it. One of the most interesting conversations in the comment section was around the future of Jonathan Isaac. Jonathan Isaac is obviously the most expendable guy on the Orlando Magic roster left if you're talking about from a trade perspective outside of Goga Batadze and potentially Wendell Carter Jr., who we'll talk about a little bit later. Obviously, the understanding for those two guys is a little bit more straightforward than Jonathan Isaac. Wendell Carter Jr. has 2 more years left on his contract, one being this year and then next year before being on a club option and then eventually becoming an unrestricted free agent 3 years from now. Goga Batadze is an expiring contract, which is typically one of the more favorable styles of contracts to trade for, especially for salary cutting teams, because that's a contract that will come up off their books at the end of the season and create cap space going into the following offseason. Jonathan Isaac, on the other hand, is in a unique position because of the fact that he has a certain level of tenure on this Orlando Magic team that has made him, in a way, interestingly enough, almost an untouchable caliber player. Like, when you think about how many times he's been brought up in trade rumors beforehand, the fact that Jonathan Isaac actually has not been moved is actually one of the more intriguing situations. And when you look at his long-term salary structure, he is a guy that is going to be on this Magic team for about $14 to $15 million over the next 4 seasons, including this one going into his age 31 season. So when you talk about having a big contract, a relatively long-term contract, and one that is taking up a roster spot for a guy that only plays about 18 to 20 minutes despite being highly productive in that time frame, he is a guy that you have to ask questions about. And the only guy that I see on this roster that creates a real logjam potentially to feel comfortable moving off of Jonathan Isaac would be this newest prospect we just drafted in Noah Penda at the power forward position. Now, the interesting thing about that is I don't necessarily think that Noah Penda provides the kind of versatility, specifically as a defender, that Jonathan Isaac does to one-for-one replace him. I don't think that he can step in and be that guy because I think that they provide 2 totally different things to a basketball team, and particularly this Orlando Magic team, where Penda comes in as a combo forward type that can be a ball handler and operate in a similar way offensively to what they would ask a guy like Franz Wagner to do as a ball handler, lead facilitator, operating in transition, as a guy who can make good decisions or be athletic enough to finish around the rim. Jonathan Isaac is a rim runner, rim defender, a player who operates really well in drop coverage as a guy who can roam. He's that kind of player. Noah Penda is not that kind of defensive player, despite the fact that he has high-level athleticism. So I think that Jonathan Isaac has a place to stay on this team long-term, as long as there's not an option that opens itself up that says that there's a defensive upgrade, right? And I'm not saying you have to get a Rudy Gobert at center in order to consider it a qualifiable trade to move over Jonathan Isaac, but you do want to see a either steady pace defensively in terms of remaining a high level rim defending team without Jonathan Isaac for whoever it is that you trade for, or you want to improve. The goal with Jonathan Isaac cannot be just as simple as shedding salary, because this team cannot shed enough salary to truly make themselves a casual first apron team anymore. This is a team that is going to be in position to have to kind of like float around or float above the first apron and just simply be doing their best to avoid the second apron, right? But Jonathan Isaac's contract alone is not going to do that. So moving off of him for nickels and dimes is not going to necessarily do anything for this Orlando Magic team besides hurt their defensive infrastructure. So although I like Penda, and I do think that he deserves legitimate minutes this year, I don't think they're with the idea of replacing a guy like Jonathan Isaac. I think they're with the idea of being able to take pressure off of a guy like Franz Wagner and Paulo Banchero, and or duplicate their roles in a more bench presence format. So although I think that Penda is a really solid player, I also believe that Jonathan Isaac just is here for the long haul. Like, I am not surprised if he does make it another 2 or 3 seasons. Next, we're going to move to a guy who I think has a bit more of a questionable future, though. And that's Jett Howard. Jett Howard was a guy that had a lot of conversation in the comment section in relation to when I brought up the idea of bringing in Victor Oladipo. It was either last episode or the episode prior to that. There was a lot of conversation around the idea of Jett Howard being a guy who now has a one-way ticket to come in as a secondary two guard and really break out this upcoming season. One of the comments actually that I'll bring up is give me 1 second. One of the comments that I saw was from 113 Lost Malice. Shout out to you. There is no way that I'm moving off of Jett Howard for a reclamation project. Talking about Victor Oladipo. With Caleb gone, Jett finally has a path for playing time. Now, he makes a really great point because he actually uses a counter argument to what I said in the Victor Oladipo video, which was that I believe that when you look at the backup two guard position, there was no definitive backup two guard that brings offensive shot creation, so Victor Oladipo could slide right in. He's saying this is a perfect opportunity now for him, being Jett Howard, to slide into said two guard role and operate as a guy who can be that off the bench scoring option for you. Now, for context, let's understand. Jett Howard averaged 4.5 points last year, along with 1.2 rebounds, less than 1 assist, shot 69% from the free throw line, nice, and also shot 29.6% from beyond the arc on 3 attempts per game. So, the idea of a Jett Howard breakout season is not necessarily going to be him averaging double-figure points, although being an off-the-bench scoring option does kind of require you to be this flamethrower attribute. And I believe that Jett Howard, as a below-average defender, in my personal opinion, is going to need to be a guy that if he's going to get legitimate minutes, it's going to come in the format of being able to score the basketball and or space the floor at a really high level. Excuse me. Jett Howard is only going to have a breakout season next year, starting with if he can take 5 to 6 3-point attempts per game and get himself up to 36% at bare minimum. Again, I just said this is a guy who, mind you, coming out of Michigan, was considered a 3-point sniper. The reason why they drafted him was because he was a guy that in college was one of the better 3-point shooters in the country and was going to be a dude that brought 3-point floor spacing at the 2/small ball 3 position. The last 2 seasons, he has shot 28% and 29.6%. If he cannot be at least a league average 3-point shooter at this level, he's not getting any minutes. And if he can be at bare minimum a league average shooter, which is about 35 to 36%, and especially on much more volume, because again, he's only taken 1.43 attempts his rookie year, 3.1 attempts last year. He needs to be in the 4, 5, 6 range. We need Duncan Robinson level production from him as a 3-point shooter. And maybe that's asking for maybe that's asking for too much, but I mean more particularly from a volume perspective than asking him to be a 40%, you know? So when we talk about the idea of addressing backup two guard, should Jett Howard get first crack at it, first dibs? Yes. And I agree with that. Do I think that he fills the archetype of what the Orlando Magic need at the two guard position? Specifically the backup two guard position, given what they have on the roster right now? I don't know. I do not know. But I do think with moving off of Caleb Houston, there not being a definitive backup two guard right now, and the idea that the money that they have in the pocket right now to be able to go after another guy who can provide that is not dense enough to be able to really go get someone the caliber of like how the Knicks were able to go get Jordan Clarkson, or how the Charlotte Hornets were able to trade for Colin Sexton, right? Like those would be two really good guys to fit the archetype that we're addressing right now. I don't think Jett Howard is going to reach that level. His ability to be a productive player on this team is going to simply be adding 3-point shooting at a high enough level to keep him on the floor because his defense is underwhelming. I don't think he's a strong player in terms of putting the ball on the floor. I actually trust a guy like Jace Richardson more as a guy with a ball in his hands to not only make decisions but also to create for himself. Jett Howard's ability to stay on the floor next season and get legitimate minutes is all going to be predicated off volume and efficiency from three, because I think it's his only ticket to real playing time. Because I don't think there's anything else that makes Jett Howard a player that's worth not exploring other options. You guys let me know in the comment section down below. There was a lot of defense around Jett Howard in the comment section, which I thought was really interesting, because I thought he was a player that I thought was a lot more expendable, especially given the presence of Jace Richardson. But a lot more people are higher on him than I expected. Next up, we're going to move to Paulo Banchero and talk about the idea of him being on a potential MVP campaign. The question comes from Lightning407. Shout out to you, my boy. And it says, my question is, do you think Paulo's numbers will dip next season with the return of Suggs and the addition of scorers like Bane and Tyus Jones? I would love to see Paulo pop off and have an MVP season. Now, obviously, his numbers are going to potentially take a hit to a certain degree because of the fact that, like he mentioned beforehand, there are going to be, quote-unquote, more mouths to feed. Now, the campaign for Paulo Banchero as an MVP caliber player, I think, is still there, very much so. And let me tell you, let's talk about where he's building off of. Last season, in the in the 46 games that Paulo Banchero played, he averaged 25.9 points, just under a steal a game, 4.8 assists, 7.5 rebounds, 72% from the free throw line, and he was a 32% three-point shooter on 5.9 attempts, 50% from the two-point line, and shot 45% from the field on nearly 20 attempts per game last year. Now, here's the thing. For me, Paulo Banchero can be an MVP caliber player simply, especially with this lineup, that with this roster construction that now adds Bane and adds Tyus Jones and brings back Jalen Suggs. Paulo Banchero can be an MVP caliber candidate simply by improving his efficiency. Very simple. Very, very simple. And I believe that with these guys, he's going to be able to average 2 or 3 assists simply off of draw and kickouts. Dump down in the post, creates a mismatch opportunity, finish around the basket. Now you're forced to be able to switch. That puts positions for guys like Tyus Jones, Desmond Bane, Jalen Suggs, Jace Richardson to be guys that are going to get left alone for kickout opportunities where now they can knock down the three ball at a high clip, right? I think he's gonna average 2 or 3 assists just off of floor spacing benefactor. I think Paulo Banchero is gonna average 2 to 3 assists a game simply off of being a floor spacing benefactor, right? He averaged 4.8 just last season. In his All-Star season prior, he averaged 5.4. I think Paulo Banchero has the ability to average 6 to 7 assists next year. I think Paulo Banchero has the ability to still average 7 to 8 rebounds next season. I think Paulo Banchero has the ability to average 25 points still, 26 points still on this team. Let me tell you why. They're going to be able to play faster. The court is going to be much more open from a floor spacing perspective, which is going to allow him to have more efficient offense. If he continues to develop from a shot selection perspective, he's also a guy. Let's not sleep on the fact, I've mentioned this on a handful of episodes about what Paulo Banchero brings to the table. The last 3 seasons, his 3 seasons in the NBA, he has averaged 7.4 free throw attempts, 7 free throw attempts. And then last season, he was on pace to average nearly 9 free throw attempts per game. And has shot a career 73% from beyond the arc. He has shot a career 73% from the free throw line. If Paulo Banchero averages 25 points, 8 rebounds, 6 assists, shoots 75 to 80% from the free throw line, and from a effective field goal percentage perspective / from the field percentage perspective, can shoot closer to 48% from the field, with an effective field goal percentage closer to 60 off of shot quality, he's going to be a top 5 MVP candidate for a team that's going to finish in the top 3 in the Eastern Conference. It's all going to come down to efficiency for Paulo Banchero. He gets to the free throw line enough. He scores enough points. He rebounds enough. He has a high-level passing IQ. It's all going to come down to efficiency. And the floor spacing aspect of this team now creates a more effective version of the things that Paulo Banchero brings to the table as a guy who can pass out of the post, as a guy who is a very good mid-range 16-footer shooter. He is a guy who is a high-level driver. Paulo Banchero is a very strong finisher around the rim. So he's going to be he should be much more efficient due to shot selection and being a benefactor of the court being as spaced as he's ever had it in what will be his 4th season in the NBA. So yes, I do think that Paulo Banchero has the chance to not only be like a legitimate MVP candidate, but like I think he can like legitimately finish in the top 5 in the MVP conversation this upcoming year, because he was already on a 2-time All-Star trajectory had he played more games last season. Now he plays in he's going to be playing on a team with more veteran leadership. Tyus Jones and Jalen Suggs are very good passers. Desmond Bane can be a high-level facilitator in spurts as well. The court is going to be much more spaced with the fact that they've added significant three-point shooting. The continuity is still there across the roster when you look at all the guys that were still retained, despite the fact that they had to let go of Gary Harris and Corey Joseph and Caleb Houston, right? They still have Wendell Carter Jr., Jonathan Isaac, Goga Batazde, Anthony Black. Like, go down the list. Jett Howard. Go down the list. Tristan Da Silva. You still have the continuity that you've brought in from the last season or two. All you're adding is more three-point spacing. And if Jett Howard, we mentioned him in the last segment, can come off the bench as that bench 2 guard and provide even more three-point shooting, it steps into another lane of Paulo Banchero having just a more fluid offense to operate within. Let's not also forget what they did from a coaching perspective, bringing in more player development and offensive minds, right? So Paulo Banchero has a real chance to be on a tear this year, and injuries subsided because we're not going to factor that in. Of course, anybody's MVP campaign can be derailed by an injury. But the one pathway to Paulo Banchero remaining not just as an All-Star, but elevating himself to MVP status, especially in the construction of this roster, where yes, there are going to be more mouths to feed, is to simply be more efficient, because at the end of the day, he's still going to be the number 1 option. And now on this team with this version of the main 8 rotation, he's going to have a more open floor than he's ever had. And I think that he has a chance to really take advantage of it. And last, let's talk about Wendell Carter Jr., who I think is in a make or break season. I think of all the bigs on this roster, I think that Wendell Carter Jr. is the guy that has the most to lose, personally. Goga Batazde is on an expiring contract. He's playing for some bread. So whether he does it on the Orlando Magic or he does it on a different team via trade, Goga Batazde, he's a guy that's going to be on the trade block simply because of his contract. Jonathan Isaac, we already discussed. He has 4 years left on his contract as a guy who feels like he's about to be a Magic lifer, right? Wendell Carter Jr., though, is owed $18 million this year, $19.5 million next season, and then has a club option for $20.9 million in 2028-2029 before becoming an unrestricted free agent in 2029-2030 at age 30. Wendell Carter Jr. essentially is playing for a contract extension this year, which could be a really good thing for the Orlando Magic. Because if the Orlando Magic are able to get a contract year Wendell Carter Jr. that's able to shoot the 3 ball at a pretty decent rate, be at least a semi-competent rim defender, and bring real stability as a floor spacer at the 5 position, not only is he going to be deserving of some money, but he's probably going to have to go somewhere else to go get that money, because I don't know if we'll be able to pay him if he is that guy that potentially does break out as a high-level three-point shooter next season. For context, Wendell Carter Jr. has not shot better than 35% for an entire season in his entire career, dating back to even the time with Chicago. He shot 36.4% in the first half of the 2020-2021 season before being traded from Chicago to Orlando. But other than that, the only time that Wendell Carter Jr. has shot 35% or better, no, he did shoot 37% the year before, 2023-2024. He shot 37% on 3 attempts per game. I think that Wendell Carter Jr. needs to be somewhere around there as a three-point shooter. 36, 37%, 3 to 4 attempts per game. Able to spread the floor. Competent defender. Competent rebounder. Right? He's averaging about 7 rebounds a game, about 9 and 7, 11 and 8. That's about what you would want from him. Especially because we play such a big lineup. Rebounding can be one of those things that's very effective in terms of, I think that one thing that could be really impactful for Wendell Carter Jr. is if he can improve as an offensive rebounder. But I think that Wendell Carter Jr. is in for a real make-or-break season, not just financially, because, again, I think that if he plays well, he'll be due for a contract extension, and if not, he will be one of the more coveted expiring contracts going into next season as a guy that would have only 1 year left on his contract before going into a club option, which I think the Orlando Magic would highly have to consider dropping due to the fact that they would be paying him $20 million. Only to probably not be able to re-sign him the following season after. Money will determine certain things by that point, but who knows what happens 3 years from now. Wendell Carter Jr. is in a very specific situation to himself, being that he is the archetype and build for what the Orlando Magic want and need from the center position. The issue that he has productivity-wise is that 3 ball has to fall in order to give this team what they need offensively from the front court space. Because Franz Wagner is not a three-point shooter right now. Paulo Banchero is not a three-point shooter right now. Wendell Carter Jr.'s comp coming out of college was Al Horford. The Orlando Magic need Wendell Carter to be their Al Horford this season, I think, if they want to be a real championship team this year. If they want to be a real championship team, I mean, look at everything else they have. Paulo, all-star / MVP caliber player. Franz Wagner, all-star / all-NBA caliber player. Desmond Bane, high-level offensive scorer, guy that can provide scrappy defense. Jalen Suggs, all-NBA caliber defender, high-level three-point shooter. Right? Jonathan Isaac, DPOY candidate if you were able to give a guy that plays 18 to 20 minutes real DPOY votes. Tristan Da Silva, ball-handling wing off the bench. Right? Anthony Black, high-level defender at the point guard position. Tyus Jones, 10-year veteran, point guard facilitator, good decision maker. Notice the only thing that I didn't mention was stretch big. Notice the only thing that I didn't mention was a guy who can operate at the big man position on the low block as an offensive shot generator, or a guy who can create his own shot off the mid post, right? Fadeaway jumper, Al Horford's really good at that. Pick and pop three-point shooter, Al Horford's really good at that. Step into mid-range jump shot, Al Horford's a solid mid-range shooter as well. Those are the things that Wendell Carter Jr. is supposed to bring to the table and has not done on a consistent basis throughout his career. In order to be able to get paid in his next lucrative deal, I think he's going to have to embrace that Al Horford role, particularly as a catch-and-shoot three-point guy at the stretch big position. If Wendell Carter Jr. can be the stretch big that he was essentially drafted to be coming out of Duke, going to Chicago, and traded for by the Orlando Magic to be, Wendell Carter Jr. is looking at like a lucrative deal of like $23 to $25 million a year. How do I know that? Because he would be better than Jakob Poeltl, who makes $20 million a year. He would be on par, if not better, than Nikola Vucevic, who just had a breakout three-point shooting season last season, by the way, which I think made it harder for him to trade because his value shot up in the Chicago Bulls' eyes, which is probably a diabolical thing given the fact that they need to just hit the reset button. But nonetheless, Wendell Carter Jr. embracing. I'll give you an interesting comp that'll actually fit this better. If Wendell Carter Jr. can simply be what P.J. Washington was archetype-wise for the Dallas Mavericks the year that they made the Western Conference run. Not a guy who averaged 20 points per game in the postseason as a knockdown three-point shooter who was shooting outside of his body, but simply the archetype of a guy who is capable of shooting the ball at that high of a clip, being a high contest rate guy at the power forward position, right? Being a guy who can trust to spread the floor at the power forward position, right? Be an Al Horford, be a P.J. Washington in Dallas, archetype of big man at that center position. And you are looking at a guy who not only would help propel the Orlando Magic to being considered as a real championship favorite coming out of the East, but I also believe that he could earn himself $23 to $25 million on the open market as a guy that either is going to get it from a team that he's traded to next season, or a guy that when the club option is declined, or in his age 30 season, if he's still on a good enough tear, could earn himself some real money. But with that being said, you guys let me know in the comment section down below what your thoughts are on some of the things that we discussed today. More particularly, my favorite one of all the things we discussed is predict the stat line for Paulo Banchero next season that you think is both realistic and MVP worthy in a league that has Nikola Jokic, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Anthony Edwards, right? It's a handful of different guys that are going to be in the mix for this. But what do you think is the stat line that Paulo Banchero is both capable of putting up and you think would be MVP caliber for him next season as part of this Orlando Magic team that is going to be a absolute menace in the East? And with that being said, remember to like, comment, and subscribe for daily Orlando Magic content, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Peace.